There are people who don't just look, they see. They walk into a room and, before anyone even says a word, they already know. They sense the discomfort in the air, perceive the tension disguised by smiles, understand the story behind a tired look. It's as if they carry an invisible lens, capable of seeing what others insist on ignoring. But what few realize is that this emotional clairvoyance is not an easy gift to carry. It is a silent burden, one that requires more than sensitivity. It requires resilience, because seeing too much, too soon, can turn life into a minefield of painful perceptions. Imagine for a moment, you walk into a room full of people laughing, music playing, lights flashing. Everyone seems happy, but something inside you senses that something is wrong. You notice the couple who haven't touched each other in hours, the friend who smiles with teary eyes, the silence disguised as empty words. And then, what should be a light-hearted moment turns into an emotional puzzle from which you cannot escape. Most people live on the surface, immersed in a sweet unconsciousness, and there is beauty in that, a certain lightness in not noticing everything all the time. But those who see what lies behind, who see the cracks in the facades, the fears in the laughter, the pain hidden in hugs, lose forever the right to live with that lightness. Because once you see it, there is no way to unsee it. Throughout our lives, we are taught to believe that seeing what others do not see is an advantage, that perceiving nuances is a sign of intelligence, empathy, evolution. But no one talks about the other side of this sensitivity, the price. No one warns you that over time, the mind of someone who perceives too much becomes a battlefield between what they feel, what they understand, and what they need to pretend not to notice. Because the world doesn't like to be seen naked. It prefers disguises, half-truths, well-rehearsed roles. And when you start to see through them, you inevitably become a threat. Observe a common conversation. People ask, "Are you okay?" and respond, "Everything's great," as if this exchange were a password for coexistence. A socially accepted, comfortable, necessary lie. Everyone knows that everything is not always okay, but no one dares to break the "we're fine" pact. Now imagine being the one who feels the weight behind those words, who hears the truth in the tone of voice and not in the sentences. It's like watching a play knowing that the script is wrong, that the actors are tired, and that, even so, the audience continues to applaud. You realize the absurdity, but you have to applaud too, because if you don't, everyone will notice that you're not part of the performance, and that's when the danger begins. Because when you see too much, you start to live on the margin. You start to feel out of place, like someone who speaks a language that no one else understands. Your perception becomes an invisible boundary between you and the rest of the world. While others continue to believe the story they tell each other, you see behind the scenes. And the clearer the plot becomes, the more distant you feel from the stage. At this point, awareness is no longer a gift. It is a kind of exile. Some say this is an exaggeration, that feeling too much is just a personality trait. But there are moments when this sensitivity becomes almost a curse. You begin to see the small acts of violence that others have normalized, to perceive the pain that no one wants to name. And suddenly, everything seems fake. The compliments, the promises, the friendships built on convenience. You try to ignore it, try to laugh at the jokes, try to relax and have fun. But something inside you insists on observing. It's a radar that won't turn off. And as much as you want to turn it off, it continues to pick up, silent, insistent, everything that vibrates beneath the surface. People like this are often called intense, complicated, dramatic. You feel too much, they say. But what no one understands is that you don't choose to feel so much. You just see, and true seeing brings with it the weight of understanding. You don't just feel your own sadness, but the sadness of the environment. Not just your own fear, but the fear that hangs over others, and that wears you down. It's like carrying the mood of an entire place inside your chest. Think about how many times you've tried to blend in, to adapt, to disguise your perception in order to fit into groups that live in superficiality. How many times have you pretended not to notice the hypocrisy of certain situations just to avoid causing discomfort? And yet at some point you realize, the more you try to fit in, the more distant you become. Because the truth is that the gaze that sees beyond will always be out of place in the world of appearance. It's curious how society functions like a big stage. Everyone plays a role, wears an emotional costume, a mask of behavior. the exemplary professional, the dedicated mother, the trustworthy friend, the perfect partner, and the show goes on. But when you start to see that the actor's smile is tired, that the applause is forced, that the lines don't match the look in their eyes, everything changes. You realize that you are watching a performance, not real life. And this awareness is not something that is easily shared, because people don't want to know that they are acting. They prefer to believe that everything is genuine. And if you try to warn them, if you dare to point out how artificial it all is, you will be seen as the problem. You will become the stranger, the critic, the one who complicates what is simple. Because the truth is uncomfortable, and those who see it too soon are always accused of spoiling the harmony. There is a cruel paradox in this. While the world values intelligence and perception, it also punishes those who take them too far. People want the light, but not the intense brightness that reveals what was hidden. They want the truth, but only to the extent that it does not threaten their illusion. That is why so many prefer to remain on the surface. There is safety in ignorance. Ignoring is, in a way, a form of protection. But those who have crossed the veil of unconsciousness can no longer return. And it is in this territory that the deepest loneliness is born. Not physical loneliness, but that of living in a world where few perceive what you see, few feel what you feel, as if you were living on another frequency, as if the world spoke in a low voice, and you heard every detail, every whisper, every lie that silence tries to hide. And this is where the invisible wound of those who see too much begins, perceiving so much that they can no longer participate. While others dance, you watch their steps. While they laugh, you analyze their laughter. While they say everything is fine, you feel that it is not. And this kind of awareness has no off switch. Some people spend their lives trying to dampen this lucidity. They drown it in distractions, lose themselves in work, in noise, in promises of an easy life. Others, braver, or more tired, simply decide to accept that they will never be naive again. But even they discover that there is a price to pay. The price of being different in a world that fears difference. There is pain in seeing too much, and there is a kind of silent danger in that. Because the more you perceive, the further you drift away. And paradoxically, the more you try to get closer, the more you perceive the gap between what is and what is said. It is the kind of awareness that does not hurt you all at once, but little by little, in every gesture you perceive, in every falsehood that your heart unwittingly deciphers. And perhaps the question that remains is this: what happens to those who see before others, to those who feel what others have not yet noticed? What happens when the gaze pierces the veil and reaches what no one else has the courage to face? That's where the real danger begins. Not physical danger, but the danger of living in a world that no longer belongs to you in the same way. Because when you start to see what others hide, you discover that lucidity has a price, and that it is not always easy to pay it. There is a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It is a loneliness that sets in even when surrounded by people, at family lunches, at work, in conversations that seem cheerful but sound empty. It is the loneliness of those who see too much, of those who see what others pretend not to see. This is the first consequence of a mind that is too awake in a world that lives asleep. It is not the lack of company, it is the absence of real connection. It is speaking and realizing that no one understands what you really meant. It's laughing out of politeness, even though you know that behind that joke there is something sick, an escape, pain disguised as humor. Over time, this creates a kind of invisible distance. You start to keep quiet more. You learn that it's easier to smile and agree than to try to explain how you feel, because explaining requires translating a language that the other person has not yet learned. And there is nothing more tiring than trying to convince someone of a truth that you see clearly, but that the other person refuses to see. Think for a moment. How many times have you noticed tension between two people and, days later, seen it confirmed in a fight or breakup? How many times have you felt that something was wrong with someone, even when everyone else assured you that everything was fine? And when you tried to warn them, were you treated as dramatic, pessimistic, or simply someone who sees problems in everything? That's right. That's how the isolation of those who perceive things before others begins. I remember a woman named Teresa. She was 56 years old, married, mother of 2 adult children. She worked in a small company, was respected, kind, loved by her colleagues. But there was something about Teresa that set her apart. She felt the atmosphere. If someone arrived sad, she felt the weight of it. If the mood in the office became tense, she absorbed it until her body ached, and over time, people began to distance themselves from her. Not out of malice, but because they felt exposed. Teresa saw too much. A glance was enough to tell when someone was lying, when the boss was praising her out of self-interest, when a colleague was disguising envy with kindness. She never confronted anyone, but her silent presence was unsettling. Once, a colleague jokingly said, "You have a look that makes me uncomfortable. It seems like you can see what I don't even know yet." She smiled, but inside she knew it was true. And so, little by little, she began to feel alone. It's curious how the truth isolates, because when you see what others deny, you start to live in a kind of parallel reality. While everyone comments on someone's success, you notice the emptiness in that person's eyes. While they celebrate an achievement, you sense the fear hidden behind it. And when you try to share how you feel, you realize that people don't want to talk about what's real. They want to keep things comfortable. This is the first form of danger, isolation. Not physical isolation, but emotional and psychological isolation. The feeling of being out of the game, as if the world were a theater, and you were in the audience, watching the actors repeat the same lines, with the same fake smiles, waiting for applause that no longer makes sense. And what happens when someone lives too long in this lucidity? The temptation arises to remain completely silent, to pretend not to see, to accept the role they expect you to play. After all, there is a weariness in swimming against the tide, in feeling everything, in understanding everything, in perceiving too much. But there is an even higher price to pay for this silence. When you remain silent to keep the peace, when you pretend not to notice in order to continue belonging, something inside you begins to break. It's as if every time you deny your own perception, a part of you dies a little. And this is where the second danger arises, that of losing confidence in what you feel. How many times have you swallowed the truth because you didn't want to create conflict? How many times have you seen something wrong but kept quiet, afraid of seeming inconvenient? At first it seems like a smart choice, but over time, it becomes an invisible prison. You begin to doubt your own instincts. You begin to wonder if you're really exaggerating, if maybe others are right. And that's how lucidity gradually turns into doubt. Anna, a 62-year-old woman, once said that she began to feel this way after she retired. She had always been observant, careful, someone who noticed details. In her group of friends, she was the one who noticed when something was wrong. When one of them started drinking too much, she tried to talk to her gently. She was told she was being intrusive. When she realized that another was in an abusive marriage, she tried to help. She was called a gossip. After so many rejections, Anna learned to remain silent. But silence did not erase what she saw. It only made everything heavier. She began to doubt her own sensitivity, thinking she was weak, that she felt too much, that it was age drama. But it wasn't. It was just lucidity trying to survive in a world that prefers not to feel. This is the drama of those who see things before others. People ask you for empathy, but they can't stand it when it comes in the form of truth. They want you to understand, but not to see. They want your affection, not your mirror. And you, without realizing it, adapt, dimming the brightness of your perception, to fit into environments that require blindness to function. There is a kind of sadness that arises when you realize you have to pretend in order to belong. It is a sadness that does not come from outside, but from the internal conflict between who you are and who you need to appear to be. And this is a pain that matures silently. Those between the ages of 40 and 60 know this feeling well. You have lived long enough to see patterns repeating themselves, lies disguised as truths, and you realize that much of what was called normal was never healthy. Suddenly you begin to see the cycles, family, professional, emotional, and understand that much of humanity survives within false narratives. But the problem with seeing is that you want to change. You want to warn others. You want to show them. You want to make them realize it too. But no one wants to look at what hurts. And when you try, you become the target. This is where the second danger manifests itself in its cruelest form, inner doubt. You speak up, and people tell you that you are exaggerating. You remain silent, and you feel that you are betraying yourself. And between speaking up and remaining silent, you are torn in two. It is a silent, almost imperceptible process. You begin to distrust your own perception. You begin to accept other people's versions as more valid than your own. And when that happens, when the gaze that was once clear becomes clouded by the need to be accepted, a kind of discreet madness arises, the madness of those who pretend not to know what they know. This happens in homes, in marriages, in companies. Think of how many meetings you've attended where everyone pretended that everything was fine, while something was clearly falling apart. A project that wasn't working, a business about to collapse, a relationship that was only maintained for appearance. You saw it, but you kept quiet. And when you finally spoke up, they called you negative, a difficult person. And then you realized, the truth is the last thing people want to hear. Maybe that's why, as we get older, we choose silence, not out of cowardice, but out of exhaustion. Because we realize that, in many cases, people don't want advice, they want anesthesia. They don't want a cure, they want comfort. And those who see the disease are not welcome where everyone else seeks distraction. The danger, then, is no longer outside. It starts to live inside, because you begin to carry a conflict between what you see and what you need to pretend not to see, between what you feel and what you need to hide. And that corrodes. It corrodes the soul, the body, the mood. It creates a kind of tiredness that doesn't go away with sleep or vacation. It is the tiredness of carrying the weight of a conscience that finds no echo anywhere. The most curious thing is that many who live through this process don't even realize. They believe they are just tired of life. But it's not fatigue. It's saturation of lucidity. It's the exhaustion of those who have seen too much. You begin to notice that conversations have changed in tone, that depth has been lost, that people talk but say nothing, and without realizing it, you begin to withdraw. You become less present, participate less, and express your opinion less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you have learned that the price of telling the truth is too high. But this withdrawal has an invisible price. It steals your sense of belonging. And a human being without a sense of belonging begins to fragment. On the outside, you continue to function. They work, pay bills, do what they need to do. But inside, there is a dense silence, a feeling of living behind glass, observing life, but not being part of it. Do you feel this? This feeling of being there, but not being there? Of seeing others smiling and knowing that there is pain behind it? Of being present, but with your soul distant, observing everything as if watching a movie on repeat? This is the second stage of danger, inner disconnection. Because when you spend too much time seeing what others don't see, there comes a time when you begin to doubt your own vision, and when you doubt, you lose touch with your own essence. And when you lose touch with what is true in yourself, it's as if the whole world loses meaning. But there is something even deeper, something that happens when you try to balance what you see with what the world wants you to see. You start living between two worlds, that of perception and that of denial. And this threshold is dangerous, because if you give yourself over too much to lucidity, you isolate yourself. If you try to fit in too much, you lose yourself. And it is at this point of tension that most people who see too much find themselves torn between the desire to belong and the need to remain true to what they feel. And perhaps the most intriguing thing is this: the world has always admired those who see first, but has rarely welcomed them. Because lucidity is beautiful in books, but uncomfortable in real life. And those who carry this keen gaze end up becoming a kind of exile from the obvious, someone who inhabits the same planet, but sees another sky. This is the loneliness of those who feel more than they should, of those who can no longer participate in the collective unconsciousness that protects the majority. And yet, even with this burden, there is something that cannot be erased, the impulse to continue seeing. Because once the eyes are opened, it is impossible to close them again. And then there remains a question that echoes silently. If seeing is dangerous, what happens when we try to live without seeing? There is something deeply unsettling about realizing how much the truth frightens people. When you start to see too much, the simple act of existing becomes uncomfortable. And the most curious thing is that the attack does not come from enemies, but from people close to you. Friends, colleagues, family. People who once said they admired your sensitivity, but who suddenly start treating you as if you were the problem. Why? Because your gaze becomes a mirror. And not everyone is ready to see themselves as they truly are. How many times have you said something with the best of intentions, a sincere observation, a word of caution, a perception, and the response was a wall, a dirty look, an awkward silence, criticism disguised as advice? You're too intense. You need to stop thinking so much. You complicate things. Deep down, what they're saying is, stop making me see what I don't want to see. And that's when the danger changes form. It ceases to be isolation and becomes projection. What others cannot bear in themselves, they deposit in you. Suddenly, you are the difficult one, the problematic one, the unstable one. But is that really the case? Or do you just refuse to participate in the collective lie that everyone calls normality? The world, deep down, is a choreography. Everyone dances to the same rhythm, repeats the same gestures, follows the same unwritten rules. And you, because you see too much, stumble. Not because you don't know how to dance, but because you realize that the music is fake, and no one forgives those who break the rhythm. There is a story that illustrates this well. A man named Renato, 61, spent his entire life working in a family business. He was honest, attentive, dedicated. One day he realized that something was wrong. Small deviations, questionable decisions, silent agreements. When he tried to speak up, he was ignored. When he insisted, the jokes began. Renato is paranoid. He's seeing things that aren't there. Shortly thereafter, the business went bankrupt, and he was left with the bitter feeling of someone who warned others, but was not heard. How many times has this happened to you? How many times has your clarity been treated as exaggeration? The most painful thing is that, over time, you start to protect yourself. You create a kind of invisible armor. You smile, agree, pretend. And inside, you carry a feeling of existential exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of someone who has understood too much and realizes that the world does not always want to be saved. But there is another, even more subtle danger. It does not come from others. It comes from within. It is when you spend so much time absorbing what you feel around you that you no longer know what is yours and what belongs to others. Have you ever noticed how sometimes you wake up feeling fine, but as soon as you meet certain people, your mood plummets? Or how you walk into a room and feel the weight of it before you even understand why? This is no coincidence. It is your body reacting to the invisible, picking up on what is between the lines. Repressed anger, contained sadness, fear disguised as kindness. The problem is that the more you notice, the more you become contaminated. It's as if your emotional system were a sponge. You absorb what others hide, and it silently accumulates inside you. Many call this empathy. But without limits, this is not empathy, it's self-destruction. Because the truly empathetic person feels with the other, not in the other's place. And there's a huge difference between understanding someone else's pain and carrying it as if it were your own. Perhaps this is the point where many viewers identify. How many times have you felt exhausted for no apparent reason? How many times have you tried to sleep, but your mind kept reliving the pain you heard from someone else? If this makes sense to you, comment below. It's important to realize how much more common this experience is than it seems. There is a curious phenomenon. The more you try to help, the heavier everything gets. Because without realizing it, you start trying to solve what is not yours, and that drains you. You try to fix other people's moods, balance the atmosphere at home, anticipate disagreements, protect those who haven't even asked for protection. And at the end of the day, what's left? A tired body and an overloaded mind. But here's a detail that few people notice. The world needs people who see. It just doesn't need that seeing to turn into suffering. Seeing is not the same as solving. Feeling is not the same as absorbing. What would happen if, instead of reacting to everything you perceive, you just observed? If you learned to see without carrying, to feel without losing yourself? It's counterintuitive, but it's precisely when you stop trying to change everything that your perception becomes more powerful, because it ceases to be an automatic reflex and becomes pure consciousness, a quiet presence that illuminates without forcing. People who live around those with this kind of sensitivity feel it. Have you noticed how some feel uncomfortable and others feel relieved? The discomfort comes from those who are afraid of being seen. The relief comes from those who were tired of pretending. You don't have to do anything. Your presence already shows what is real. But there is a price to pay for this role as a human mirror. The more you reflect the truth, the more people will try to distort you. They will accuse you of creating problems, of being negative, of thinking too much. No, and that's where the danger lies. Believing those voices. Because when you start to doubt your own gaze, you start to lose your footing. Doubt is the poison of the intuitive. It makes you seek validation outside yourself, when you always knew, inside, what was true. So, an important question: how many times have you betrayed yourself just to be accepted? How many times have you ignored what you felt because it was easier to agree? How many times have you doubted your own clarity to preserve a relationship, a job, an appearance of peace? If this touches you in any way, speak up in the comments, not to vent, but to show those watching that they are not alone in this experience. Because there is something liberating about realizing that this pain is shared. Lucidity can isolate, but it can also unite. And what differentiates one from the other is awareness. When you understand what is happening inside you, what once seemed like a curse begins to turn into strength. The gaze that once pushed you away now protects you. The sensitivity that once drained you becomes a filter. You stop absorbing and start observing. But be careful. Observing is not distancing yourself from the world. It is participating in it with a different kind of presence. It is being whole, but with boundaries. It is feeling everything, but choosing what belongs to you. Imagine yourself as a river. The river flows, touches everything around it, but never ceases to be water. It does not carry the stones it encounters, it just goes around them and follows its course. Those who see too much need to learn to be like the river, to touch without accumulating, to understand without getting lost. And perhaps this is the most difficult lesson for those who feel the invisible. Understanding that not everything needs an answer, that there are pains that do not ask for healing, only witness, that there are people who do not want help, only someone to see them. Deep down, this is what everyone is looking for, to be seen, not analyzed. And you, with the clarity you carry, can offer exactly that, presence. But there is one detail that changes everything. You can only offer what you have already learned to give yourself. So if you want others to see you, start by truly seeing yourself. Not as the world says you are, but as you truly feel. Because lucidity, when not accompanied by self-compassion, becomes a weapon pointed at your own chest. Perhaps the secret is not to see less, but to forgive yourself for seeing so much. And to accept that even when you see the shadows, you can still choose the light. Now tell me, what is more dangerous, seeing too much or pretending not to see? Perhaps the answer lies not in one extreme, but in the invisible balance between the two. Seeing without suffering, feeling without losing yourself. This is the frontier that few can cross, and where perhaps true freedom begins. There comes a moment when eyes tired from seeing so much begin to desire a new way of seeing. A point where lucidity, once sharp, can finally become gentle. And that is precisely where consciousness finds its purpose, not in seeing more than others, but in learning to see differently. For centuries, philosophers, therapists, and thinkers have spoken about this balance between perception and peace. Carl Jung called it the process of individuation, the path in which human beings cease to be prisoners of the masks of others and begin to live according to their own center. It is curious how, even without knowing this concept, so many people live it in practice. They are ordinary, anonymous people who have decided to stop fighting what they see, just learn to deal with it. A 2024 study by Stanford University showed that highly sensitive individuals, when trained to identify their own emotions before reacting to the emotions of others, reduce their levels of chronic stress by up to 47%. This means that it is not seeing too much that destroys, it is not knowing what to do with what you see. But how can we transform this perception into something that does not hurt? How can you stop being a radar for pain and become a beacon of awareness? The answer begins with acceptance, because the first step to living in peace with what you perceive is to stop wishing you didn't perceive it. You are not wrong for feeling too much, for noticing too much, for understanding what others take years to comprehend. This is not a defect, it is refined sensitivity. And all sensitivity needs direction, not denial. Think about how fire works. It can destroy a forest, but it can also heat a house. What changes is not the fire, it is how it is used. Perception works the same way. If you don't learn to control it, it consumes you. But if you learn, it illuminates you. Marta, 58, retired, lived most of her life carrying the weight of feeling too much. She said she felt like an emotional sponge. She cried over other people's suffering and exhausted herself trying to solve her family's dramas, until one day, after a nervous breakdown, she heard something simple from a therapist. You don't have to absorb to understand. That phrase changed everything. Marta began to observe more and react less. When she noticed tension, she would take a deep breath and ask herself, Is this mine? Or is it someone else's? And most of the time, she realized it wasn't hers. A few months later, her health improved, her sleep returned, and the feeling of exhaustion disappeared. Not because she stopped seeing, but because she learned to see without losing herself. How many situations in your life could change if you started doing the same? How much pain that seems inevitable today may only be there because you've gotten used to carrying it, thinking it was yours. The secret lies in establishing emotional boundaries, something we don't learn when we grow up. We learn to be kind, to care, to understand, but we don't learn to say, "This doesn't belong to me." Idai. And when there is no boundary between what is yours and what belongs to others, everything gets mixed up. Joy, guilt, sadness, fear. That's why so many people reach their 50s and 60s feeling exhausted, even without understanding why. The body gets tired because the mind never shuts down, and the mind doesn't switch off because the heart is carrying the world. But there is a way back, a way to continue seeing without suffering, and it can be practiced in simple, concrete, applicable steps. First, intentional silence. Not the silence of those who are silent out of fear, but of those who need to hear their own voice without the noise of others. Set aside 10 minutes of quiet every day. No screens, no conversation, no music, just you and your breath. It seems like little, but it is in those minutes that the mind clears. That's when the emotional mud begins to settle, like murky water that becomes clear again. Second, naming. Name what you feel. Don't say "I feel bad." Say "I feel angry," "I feel anguish," "I feel sad." When a feeling has a name, it ceases to be a cloud and becomes something that can be observed, and what can be observed can be understood. Third, the symbolic return. When you realize that you are carrying something that is not yours, your child's worries, your partner's stress, someone else's past guilt, close your eyes and imagine returning that weight to its source. It may seem too simple, but neuropsychology studies show that the brain reacts to symbols with the same force as it reacts to facts. When you symbolically return it, your body understands that it has been released. And finally, presence. The present is the only place where the weight of the world diminishes, because what hurts the sensitive is not what is happening now. It is what they feel for what has already been, and what they fear for what is to come. When you anchor yourself in the present moment, you realize that nothing is as heavy as it seemed when it was only in your mind. These 4 steps, silence, naming, returning, and present, form a simple but powerful practice. And the most beautiful thing is that it requires nothing more than awareness. But there is something even more transformative, understanding that you don't have to heal anyone. Repeat this out loud if you like. I don't have to heal anyone. Because it is precisely this impulse to save the world that destroys those who see too much. Psychologist Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, wrote that the deepest human freedom is to choose one's own attitude in the face of circumstances. You cannot control another person's suffering, but you can control what you do with your feelings about it. And that changes everything. Those who learn to see without judging, to perceive without trying to correct, become a silent force of balance. And in a world that cries out for attention, serenity is an act of revolution. Think about the people who have had the greatest impact on you throughout your life. Were they the ones who forced you to change, or the ones who looked at you with patience, allowing you to change on your own? True clarity does not force, it inspires. It does not confront, it illuminates. So perhaps the greatest transformation you can offer the world is not to teach others to see, but simply to continue seeing, calmly, consciously, without letting yourself be consumed. Because when you do that, your presence is already enough healing. And if you want to put this into practice, start today with a small commitment. For the next 24 hours, observe everything you feel. But don't react immediately. Just observe. See how the way people affect you changes. See how the weight of environments changes. Write down what you notice. This simple exercise, repeated for a week, begins to change the brain. Stress networks diminish, and self-regulation networks strengthen. You begin to live from the inside out, and no longer reacting to everything that happens outside. Over time, you discover something liberating. It is not the world that needs to be less chaotic. It is your gaze that needs to learn to remain serene within the chaos. And that's when seeing too much ceases to be a sentence and becomes wisdom. Because when lucidity meets compassion, emotional maturity is born. And maturity is not about not feeling, it's about feeling everything, but choosing what inhabits you. Perhaps this is the greatest lesson of all. You can continue to see, but now with peace. You can continue to perceive, but without carrying the burden. You can remain awake, even in a world that insists on sleeping. And if this message has touched you, if at any point in your life you have felt tired of perceiving too much, share it in the comments, even anonymously. Sometimes the simple act of writing down what you feel is the first step toward freeing yourself from the weight of feeling alone. And if you want to continue diving into this type of reflection, with real stories, discoveries about the mind, and ways to live more consciously, subscribe to the channel now. Leave your like so that this content reaches more people, and write in the comments what you feel most when you perceive what others do not see. Maybe your experience is exactly what someone needs to hear today.